welcome to Week in Review. And my name's Cobus Bester. 2 weeks ago, the country's main opposition party, the Democratic Alliance, ended off its policy conference underwriting a new policy called that, and underwriting non-racialism. I think they were surprised at the negative reaction they got from certain quarters. So was I, actually, to admit that quite a few people I expected who would have been positive about this announcement came out very strongly against it. So we thought we'd get the policy chief of the DA along to News and Review. That's Gwen Ngwenya, for those who haven't taken notice of her so far. Been around in the DA for some years now, has been one of the strong people, especially regarding policy. And Gwen, thank you for joining us today and welcome. And our panel today, as usual, Piet Croucamp, Dr. Piet Croucamp from Northwest University, and joining us for the first time, Dr. Ivor Sarakinsky. He's from the Wits School for Governance. And welcome to all panel members as well. Gwen, my first question really is, were you surprised by the reaction on this whole issue around non-racialism and the route you want to take on that?
Well, not surprised from those who one would have expected to share that view. I mean, this is not, when I say that I think the commentariat is relatively ideologically, obviously not aligned with the D. I don't say that as a problem. It's just that in South Africa, obviously, you don't have the full spectrum that might then provide an alternative view. So, I mean, I've never thought that commentators or journalists necessarily discern their job completely with no, political context or viewpoint of their own. And so I think that's just what you see, is that those who probably would have not inclined to define non-racialism in the way that we have obviously then come out to express their view that they are opposed to this, as one would expect.
Panel, it's over to you.
Gwen, just one question. From the media and serious commentators and people in the academia, there were a lot of criticism. That's true, but from the DA side, and I think Gareth van Olsen joined in the fray a little bit, there was this almost insulting thing about them either being stupid or uninformed or ideologically compromised. So I understand that you could have been offended to some extent by the response to non-racialism, but why this derogatory way of going about with people who, I think, even Stephen Grootes, who honestly tried to just assess the situation?
Well, certainly not from my side. I mean, I'm not typically, in the habit of using ad hominem to engage in debate. So I think maybe some do engage that way. It's never been the way that I engage with ideas. But I may have said, on my part that, it's misinformed when people say that it's a right-wing turn or that kind of usage. I think if one analyzes the non-racial position we took in that way, then it does actually say something quite concerning about the level of historical and political insight of our commentariat, because nothing could be further from the truth. I mean, he's kind of now become like the flogging horse for this side, but I think because everyone is just so familiar with his views, for the likes of Neville Alexander, who was a self-declared socialist, but I mean, even the early conception of non-racialism as a rejection of racial classification is one that I think actually has deep kind of, leftist roots. And at least today, in my eye, it's definitely not a left or right issue. It's a kind of bipartisan stance on non-racialism. Sure, some would disagree with it, but I think those who disagree with this kind of definition of non-racialism, you will find them both on the left and the right, and those who agree with it will also be found on the left and the right. I just don't think it's accurate to say that the rejection of race is a right-wing.
But why? Again, why is it that all white South Africans are so happy with this idea of non-racialism, whereas amongst black South Africans there's a lot of skepticism? But I find it very, very strange that the bell doesn't ring for you when all the whites that I've spoken to on social media are utterly happy with your idea of non-racism. Something must warn me there's something wrong there.
Why? I mean, 99% of those who've disagreed with it are white. Carol Payton, Stephen Grootes, most of the write-ups have come from white South Africans. Peter Bruce.
Yeah, it's true.
So it seems to me that there are just as many white South Africans who disagree. I don't think it's accurate to say that it's white South Africans agree and black South Africans don't. Again, it's completely, race doesn't say, what your ideological leaning or political beliefs would be on this.
Yeah, sorry, just one last question before we ask Ivor. But the fact is that I'm also against it, but I criticize it because I see that most white South Africans well, it's very likely that you might get some of the white vote back on the back of non-racialism, and it's very likely that you will not win any vote. And I know you've said somewhere that there's something inherently wrong with this argument that black people won't vote for a Liberal Party or for this idea, this definition of non-racialism that you have. But it unfortunately, I will be very surprised if black South Africans come back to the party in droves. And I am dead sure that this idea of non-racialism that you pursue might bring you back some white votes. And that there's some anomaly, there's some contradiction here that it must be disturbing. That it's not the same. If you compare and say, well, let's look at the history of non-racialism in South Africa, it's not the same narrative that you're talking about. It's something very, very different, isn't it?
No, Piet, what I find disturbing is the idea that we see a lot of white South Africans running to an idea it must be wrong, but if a lot of black South Africans are agreeing with it, it must be right. I mean, that's a completely bizarre way to analyze good and bad ideas. I certainly don't look at the racial demographic of who agrees or disagrees with me. It's a bizarre way of approaching policy. It's not how I do it. I suppose one could do that to try and do a kind of census check on all their ideas and see whether there are more black or white South Africans who agree with them. And then you could select your beliefs on the race of who supports them. But it's just not the way that I approach policy making.
Ivor, if you look at this, is it the same when Gwen compares the non-racialism that she's defined in her policy, and she refers back to the ANC's history of non-racialism in South Africa and the liberation movement, is it the same thing that you're talking about, or is it something different?
But by the way, I don't know the ANC's history. Sorry, Ivor, before you, I haven't found our definition on the ANC's history, but Ivor, you can go ahead.
Of liberationism. It isn't liberationism. Okay, Ivor, what do you say?
No, we can have the historical argument about what non-racialism means in particular political trajectories. And I'm not sure how constructive that will be in terms of clarifying what needs to be done now in South Africa in terms of finding solutions to complicated and intricate problems. So I'm agnostic on this policy proposal, which is non-racial in terms of DA policy and redress and a whole range of issues that are linked to that. I'm open to being convinced. And what I think is it has some potential because it allows for breaking away from blunt instruments in terms of redress for past injustice and disadvantage. And also one has to find a way to stop the same people getting access to the scarce resources that are available repeatedly. And that means one has to broaden it out. And I think that that's a useful starting off point. And I'm open to that. And I've said that on a number of occasions in different media. I have different problems with it in terms of the what one might call the race essentialism dimension to the policy. My concerns are, is it coherent and does it go far enough in terms of non-racialism? And that I think we could possibly explore in the conversation that develops.
Gwen?
Something quickly, to Ivor's point is that, I mean, that for me is the starting point, is that in some ways, not that non-racialism are important, but it's kind of the secondary aspect of the policy. So at its core, the economic justice policy that we've released is a policy about how we address economic inequalities, which yes, have their roots in an apartheid and segregated past, but which still very much persists today. And it breaks down the key drivers of inequality in South Africa today. Again, not ones that we have made up. This comes from, from the kind of research the World Bank has done, that Stats SA has put out there, showing what the key drivers of economic inequality are. And they're actually quite concise in some ways. So obviously it's unemployment, which drives income inequality. It's around differentials in healthcare, mobility, spatial inequalities, etc., which the paper outlines, and then starts to provide proposals against those inequalities. So that's very much the departure point of the paper. But what it says is that all of these things which drive inequality in South Africa can be addressed very much like how social grants in a way have, and also our tax system is progressive. There are many policies that have been put in place to begin the task of economic redress, which are not based on. So it says this is how we can address each of these inequalities. By the way, we so happen to be doing them in a non-racial way. But that's very much the by the way, it's non-racial. We don't identify beneficiaries according to their race. We identify beneficiaries according to the relevant means taken in that area. So I would like to have also a conversation that really does then delve into this particular approach, because I think that's the main hurdle. The main hurdle is to get South Africans agreeing, for all of us to be on the same page, that we must define redress, the task of redress, in this way. That the way we must define redress is saying, what progress are we making towards addressing these drivers of inequality? Whereas at the moment, the task of redress is usually analyzed or measured according to the racial demographics of the stock exchange, ownership, the racial demographics of executive positions, which, yes, you may want to use as one of the indicators, but it's such a narrow way of analyzing redress. Pick any paper today that looks at the failure of economic redress, and they will tell you about the lack of transformation in the ownership of the stock exchange, or the lack of transformation in various executive positions. These are very much elite concerns. Even if, as I say, I think, as I've said before, even if every single CEO in South Africa was Black, even if the entire shares on the stock exchange was owned by Black South Africans, you could still have that only be representing 2% of society. So you could still have both a Black elite as well as have the vast majority of South Africans living in poverty. So the racial demographics of the elite tell you nothing about how the majority are faring, is essentially the point of this paper. And saying that we have to indicate, tell you about the conditions of the majority.
So does this mean you will do away with Black economic empowerment as a policy? I'm not talking about the way that the ANC is implementing it, because I think we all accept that that doesn't work, and it's just a source of corruption. But just the idea, the narrative of Black economic empowerment, do you think there's no room in terms of policy for that?
Well, I mean, I think that, of course, this policy will result in the empowerment of those who are classified as Black under apartheid, is the point. So we're not moving away from it. We're presenting an alternative. So this is how we do empowerment better. This is how to ensure that the majority of South Africans have the conditions that they face actually addressed. So if you go, and a lot of people talk about it in the abstract, and the DA doesn't care about people in townships. I mean, these are people that are my family. I have people, I have family in the township. I'm going next weekend back to Durban. I'll visit my grandmother who lives in Mlaz. I have family members who are unemployed. So this is not like academic, to me. And when you talk to people, their concerns aren't around procurement rules and who can, access to tenders and the demographics of executive positions. They don't tell me that, oh, we hate that the executive of this and that company is not representative of the country. No, their concerns are that I'm sick and there's no decent clinic, and the effects that has on economic mobility. They care about the high cost of transport, which increases reservation wages and keeps people unemployed, because and that's actually a huge problem we don't talk about enough in South Africa as well. The fact that if it costs you just 400 Rand a day, for example, to travel to and from work, you're not going to accept a job that pays you less than 400 Rand a day, because effectively you're then paying for that job. So the high cost of public transport in South Africa and having people living very far from areas of economic activity means that those transport costs drive up reservation wages, et cetera, et cetera. But these are the kinds of problems that weigh on on people's daily existence. And so I think any policy that fundamentally says we are refocusing the attention of empowerment onto, we're essentially going to have a scorecard that looks at, if you want to call it a scorecard, we're essentially going to look at, this is like the SDGs, right? We're going to look at access to healthcare. We're going to look at mobility costs. We're going to look at spatial inequalities and land reform. These indicators that are going to tell us whether our redress agenda is succeeding or not. It's not primarily the demographics of the JSE or executive positions that's going to tell us about whether we're succeeding in redress or not.
Ivor?
Gwen? Ivor?
Well, so I think Gwen is preempting the direction that I would like to take the discussion for a moment. The SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, are indicators. The World Bank puts forward also measures of economic and inclusion performance. But those are indicators, they're not policies. When you talk about policy, it's the kinds of things you're going to do to achieve those goals that are set out in those measures, which are very detailed and very powerful measures in terms of a country's performance, in terms of socioeconomic development. So there's no disagreement on the value of that. My concern is slightly different. If I go through the policy document, I see that there's a focus on the legacy of disadvantage, and it's stated very clearly there in the section on redress. And then I read through the document further to see what are the policies that are in place in that document to actually achieve redress. So I say, okay, the logic is we're not going to use race. We could use a whole range of other measures like household income, etc. No problem with that. But I'm not seeing enough in the documents about specific policy issues that are going to achieve the redress that's spelt out perhaps at a rhetorical level. So if you're going to say spatial apartheid needs to be addressed, that means the burden is to put in place a set of programs that you'll support by ring-fencing finance to enable disadvantaged people to have closer access to the cities. And I'm not seeing that in any clear way. What we see is broad statements about better governance, which of course makes a difference generally. We're seeing focus on education, focus on health, focus on infrastructure, but we're not seeing focus on specific policy issues that will enable redress. And the issue of Tafelberg in Cape Town municipality, to go back to a DA-governed municipality and province, is really important here, because there's an opportunity to enable breaking down the barriers of apartheid spatial development. And the courts ruled, and now Western Cape government's taking that on appeal. So I'm not seeing the policy. What I'm seeing in action are a range of decisions which cast doubt perhaps on the commitment to the micro detail policy of achieving redress. So if students need to go to better schools, what are the precise policy mechanisms in place to improve the performance of schools, to improve health, to create access to employment opportunities? It can't just be a kind of broad trickle down, we will govern better, we will create more opportunity. You've got to address past inequality through an intervention. Currently, it's a race-based intervention, and I take the argument that's put forward in the policy documents, but I'm not seeing enough of specific interventions that would address those past legacies.
Gwen?
Well, I would say, that's probably not true. If you look at the document and you just, for example, do a word search for spatial inequality, it's in the contents page as well, but if you go to the section on spatial inequality, there are a great number of proposals about addressing that and around land reform that we make. But I can't read out the whole policy here, but I would say that that's not true. There are sections on spatial inequality, there are sections on land reform, namely about, that redistribution of state-owned land has to come first in order to, before you move on to the harmful debate about expropriation without compensation. There's great tracts of state-owned land that we should be making use of. we talk about allocating the land, that the problem is rather with the allocation of money to the budget, to land reform, as opposed to the fact that there aren't, the fact there are scarce resources to addressing the land reform issue. And we cite the fact that for, the trend has been over the years for less than 1% of the budget to go to land reform, despite it being supposedly such a salient issue, and even greater budgetary allocation being made to non-essential items such as VIP security, and that we obviously have to turn that around. We have to give land reform the priority in the budget that it deserves before we can say that there are scarce resources to expropriate with compensation. So, I mean, there are a number. And then we also talk about the failures of SPLUMA, the Spatial Planning and Land Use Management Act. I mean, there are a number of specific policy interventions there. But what I would agree with is that the main point of this policy document is to outline the framework under which we would carry out redress. But of course, you then have to have a standalone education paper, a standalone housing paper. You can't have all your policies in one document. So I do agree that the majority of the work, or the heavy lifting that this document attempts to do, is to introduce a new framework for empowerment. So to move away from what we are saying is actually trickle-down redress, this idea that businesses, by co-opting the political elite onto their boards, onto executive management, by share ownership, that this equates to redress. We're saying instead, redress has to be about the issues that affect the majority of South Africans, healthcare, etc., blah, blah, blah. And then we outline what some of our sort of top line, if you want to call them then, interventions in each of these areas are. But absolutely, then we have to ensure that our standalone policies support this particular policy framework. But I do think that in here to start to give you a sense of the kinds of interventions we would make in each of these areas. But I agree, that's when you then also need to look at our standalone policy. So for example, on housing, we say some things about housing and spatial inequality here, but we still do have a housing policy. And actually in the moment, we are working on an inclusionary housing policy, specifically around our approach to affordable housing, which we hope to release soon.
When just the part of Ivor's reference to Cape Town and the court case, what is your answer to that? If you can just focus on that for a second.
Sure. I mean, my answer to that is that, I mean, that's one specific case. The city of Cape Town, I don't have the, information in front of me because I don't think that would be a topic of discussion. But I know that there are a number of affordable housing projects. There's one, I can't remember the name off the top of my head, that's actually been, I think they were like sort of launching or announcing it this week. So there are a number of housing projects always underway. So I don't think one housing project or one, asset which the courts have deemed should be used for affordable housing or inclusionary housing means that there's no housing programs at all. That's just not true.
Gwen, does it worry you, Piet, if I can? The one thing that I've been wondering about is whether it worries you, Gwen, if you look at the reaction, and as I mentioned at the beginning, there's been a lot of negative reaction. You're saying, I think, one of the things you've been saying is that people don't quite understand, or maybe they've misread or misunderstood. Are people in the DA communicating clearly enough to those people who should be taking the message further?
Yes, I mean, for some of them, I don't think that the message is understood. I mean, some clearly understand, they just disagree. If I think some of the articles written subsequently that were saying that, we cannot move away, or we should not rather move away from race, and that race is going to be with us forever. Well, that's the particular worldview of that person writing. It's not because they misunderstand the policy that we're proposing. They understand it, but they don't agree with it. So I also wouldn't want to reduce every disagreement to a case of not understanding. So all we need to do is help them understand. No, some people understand very well. They're just opposed to non-racialism as a particular stance. And I think that's why it was also so important from my perspective to highlight and to define non-racialism, precisely because I could notice in South Africa and in the discourse that, almost everyone commits themselves to this idea of non-racialism, whichever debate or discussion you might be in, across the spectrum, everyone commits themselves to non-racialism. And I thought, how could this be that everyone says they believe in non-racialism, yet I get a distinct feeling that everyone means something different by it. So I think it's important to say, what exactly do we mean when we talk about non-racialism? And you can see as a result of defining it, that now suddenly there's a much richer debate around non-racialism. Now it suddenly appears, actually, not everyone is on the same page about non-racialism as we had originally thought. And as I suspected, many people don't actually, in my view, don't believe in non-racialism. They'd started calling multiracialism non-racialism. So what a lot of people want is actually a multiracial society. And that's very different to what a society would want if you want a non-racial society. And I think it was very important to get that distinction clear.
Gwen, can I ask you just one thing? Do you know, I think there's general consensus that in the last election that Black South Africans either voted for other parties or they didn't vote for the DA. And on the conservative side, I would say the Afrikaners, they went back to the Freedom Front, they went back home. But do you guys know exactly why it is that Black South Africans didn't vote for you or left the party? And how do you tie it up with this idea of non-racialism? Why do you think this idea will necessarily get them back into the party, or was that not the aim of the policy?
No, it really wasn't. I mean, from my point of view, I head up the policy unit, and our objective is to, well, obviously, it's important to consider what the values and principles, what the ideological, if you want to call it that, viewpoint of the party is, and that's important. I'm not one of those people who thinks we need to take ideology out of politics. That's a completely meaningless statement, and at least the worst kind of pragmatism in my view. But at the same time, you can't have a policy platform that's purely based on ideology, because then that leads to dogma, right? You have ideology without evidence. So the task is to combine both, is to say, we have to be open to the evidence and to evidence-based an approach to policy. And that's how I look at it. I must be honest that no policy is written with the aim of whether it's vote winning or not. And I think that's quite right, because you have to have a policy platform that is based on evidence and that is true to principles. Then those who worry about marketing and communication, then you can start to think about, okay, let's say the right position is not one that is palatable to voters. Then you can start to say, okay, how do we communicate something that is not initially palatable, and how can we persuade? But you can't start from the other way around. You can't start with, let's start with what's palatable and then let's try and make that correct or based on evidence. It will never work that way. So that's really the answer, is that the policies are not written with the view as to whether they are vote winning or not. They are just written with a view to whether do we think they will solve the problem that we have identified or not. And we do think that this is a good approach, a sound approach to addressing inequality.
Ivor?
Yeah, well, we can argue about general statements versus policy instruments in the current document, and that could take us in various directions. But let me take another or a different tack for the moment. If one's not going to use race as your criteria for accessing resources to redress past inequality and disadvantage, if you're going to have socioeconomic measures as an alternative to race criteria, non-racial criteria for that matter, how are you going to do that? It sounds easy, but it's remarkably difficult. How are you going to establish the thresholds in terms of household income, which allows communities to get access, or individuals or households to get access to certain resources based on the thresholds that you've set? What I'm asking in addition to that is, doesn't that imply incredible transaction costs and red tape in terms of establishing exactly what the measures are before you can even roll out the redress? So I'm not seeing, and we disagree, and that's fine, I'm not seeing a cohesive mechanism linked to the policy, but at the same time, I'm not seeing how the non-racial socioeconomic measure is going to be executed as the criteria to access the resource. And at the same time, when you put that in place, you open up all kinds of opportunities for gaming the system, denying household incomes, playing all kinds of games. How will that be managed? Because surely these are things that have been thought of before announcing the policy in the first instance. And I'm not seeing enough in the document itself to satisfy my queries here.
Yeah. I mean, in the document, it does talk about means being used to assess who will, access the various programs. But I think it's not as difficult as it's being made out to seem. Already in South Africa, we've got programs in various areas that are based on identifying those who are in need. So in housing, there might be income bands. It might be based on the medium, to access affordable housing. It might be based on those who are living and working in the area, but earned below the median income of that particular area. And they've been identified as potential beneficiaries to access affordable housing. In grants, you use means for educational programs. I know that there are various people in education who've got issues with the quintile system, but I use it here not to kind of champion it and say it's the best way, but I'm just trying to point out that within each area, there usually are indicators of which individuals are disadvantaged. So you could identify schools based on quintiles, or alternatively based on educational outcomes. But in every area, whether you're talking about housing or education, in all the various areas identified, there usually are indicators that would tell you who are the people that are disadvantaged in this particular area. I don't think it's that difficult. Otherwise, we would never have been able to roll out housing programs, educational programs, and all the like up to this point, which clearly many companies do already through their kind of CSI and other interventions. And also government does. Government earmarks funding for no-fee schools. That's also a potential criteria to target interventions at no-fee schools, which usually correlates well with a certain demographic disadvantaged group attending those schools. So I think it's actually relatively, I'm not saying those measures can't be improved. We can debate as to whether no-fee schools is a good indicator for which schools are in need, and we can argue whether school quintiles is a good indicator, but I think those indicators exist in each area, and then we can talk about maybe improving them where necessary.
Now, they do exist. Just a quick comeback, if I may. Sometimes, and I know some examples of this with schools, there are the thresholds in terms of no fees. And what happens is that schools don't fill in the forms for the learners because they lose income. And you end up with a perverse outcome where the school gets less and less subsidy with less and less fees being paid, which results in a dramatic decline. So it's a micro problem. It requires mechanism, and it requires a lot of thought in terms of how it's going to work. And that's my question with the policy documents. The broad statements, broad principles, but when it comes down to the mechanism and how it's going to work, I'm seeing that there's room for work to be done there. That's so not a clear or direct criticism of the policy, but for me, a clear gap in terms of how they've been drafted.
I must say, Ivor, in one, the DA, for some other reason, I might be wrong, we for years now been saying that they don't have any policies. We commend them for having a policy. Now we just disagree about some of the policy, but the things in the policy. But I think at last Gwen brought the idea of policy back into the DA, and I'm sure Helen Zell and a lot of people say, well, we had policies all these years, but it was a valid perception out there that there wasn't any policy. I just want to ask you something different, Gwen.
Last question, Piet.
Yeah, it reminds me a bit of a chartered accountant making the sums, crunching the numbers, and then say, well, these are beautiful numbers now, but you still have to get the political buy-in into that. What are the chances that this policy of non-racialism, and you write it well and you go into the detail, the smaller detail eventually in a few months' time and a whole lot, but you cannot sell it to South Africans. And it sounds like you rather flippant about the idea that that large numbers of people will have to vote eventually for you and will have to vote for these policies. You can't have a political party and say we have wonderful policies, but nobody's going to vote for us. I'm sure that DA would like to present an alternative to the ANC. But if you argue that it's not important, or we didn't develop these policies with the idea in mind that people will have to vote for these policies, you also say that we don't present necessarily alternative to the ANC. And I think South Africans are really, really desperate for an alternative to the ANC. But Black South Africans, is my gut feeling, will not vote for this policy. It's been designed by a number cruncher, theoretically, by a chartered accountant that does not necessarily take into consideration the outcome of that policy. Political outcome.
Yeah, I mean, as I explained, it's not that policy must obviously be communicated to people. What I'm trying to say is that that's when you then do the work of saying, how do we communicate it? It's like if a government wanted to introduce marriage laws in a deeply conservative society, you can start off with a position saying that that's the right policy position, that's the right thing to do. Then you go on to saying, okay, we live in this is the current context. How do we convince a society that believes X in this policy? But you can't start with saying, well, because we live in a conservative society, we can't possibly solve the idea of gay marriage. So that's all I was saying about policy, is that we start first with discussing what would be the right position to deal with this particular challenge. Then once you have that idea of what the right position is, of course, you then have to engage with how, what is the context you're trying to introduce this idea in, what is the best way to go about it. So that does weigh on the party's mind. It just doesn't necessarily weigh in the minds of the unit that I work in. I don't think that policy itself must be designed with a majoritarian consideration. We have to assist the party to say, this is what we think from principle and evidence would be the right approach. Then the party has to apply its mind to, okay, so how do we communicate this? And as I said, I don't think it's, the partying kind of thing around policy and voting behavior, I think you would know that, I think it's misguided to say that voters vote on policy. I wish they did, but they don't. I think in years gone past, you could have literally given the ANC the policy platform of the DA, and I'm pretty sure that wouldn't have had a drastic result in the electoral outcome. It's an unfortunate thing that someone like me who's interested in policy has to admit to, but I recognize that most people don't straightforwardly vote on policy positions. So there's a lot more that a party needs to do than simply have the right policies. It's a much more complicated game than that. And how a party assesses its success has to be based on its potential target. If I may just quickly maybe expand on that point to say that it's kind of very similar to the private sector, I make this example frequently, that if you wanted to sell a particular confectionery, let's just say, you couldn't say to potential investors that your target market is every single consumer. You'd be laughed out of the bank or out of that investment meeting. You have to identify who the potential consumers of your product are. So similarly, in a political party, I don't think the exercise is very different. You have to say, okay, we are a non-racial, liberal political party that believes in the following things. What is the market for such a party in a country like South Africa? And then let's say you say, okay, the market is 50%. Okay, so that's what we judge ourselves against. How much of the potential market are we managing to bring in? You can't judge yourself against a market that might never vote for a political party with your values and principles. But I do think it's important to hold then that ground, to get as much of your available or potential market share as possible, because then I think it places the DA in a solid position to be a critical part of a new government, particularly a coalition government of the future. We do think that coalition politics are going to be the long-term future of South Africa, not just at the local, but at the national level. And we plan to be a very important partner when that happens.
Gwen Ngwenya speaking there. Thanks, Gwen, for taking part today. We appreciate your presence. And my panel, Ivor Sarakinsky of Wits School of Governance and Piet Croucamp of Northwest University. And tune in again next Sunday at 5. And in the meantime, have a nice week. And we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.